Hello everyone, I'm Michaela Kathleen and this is my July wrap-up. I read 3 books this month and the first one was Crazy Rich Asians by Kevin Kwan. And this one actually ended up being kind of a partial DNF, which, to explain that, the week that I was reading it, I was going to be visiting my parents that weekend, and the next book on my TBR was Brazinger, which is quite a large book, and so I didn't really want to haul that with me, and I didn't really feel like starting it for like 2 days and then like not reading for 2 days. So I decided to just keep reading this. Even though I didn't end up reading it at all at my parents', it's small enough that I could bring it along just in case I wanted to read. And then also, it just felt pointless to DNF it and switch to something else that I was going to have to stop reading for 2 days very soon after. But yeah, definitely if I hadn't had that next very large book in line, I probably would have fully DNF'd this by the halfway point, maybe even before then. As it was, when I went to my parents, I still had, I think, 100 pages left. And so when I got back, it was a little enough amount that I didn't want to just totally DNF it, but I also was not ready to commit another 100 pages, especially because I had some really exciting books on my list for the rest of the month. So what I ended up doing was I skipped ahead to the last chapter and I read the last chapter, and I had seen the movie, so that was kind of another factor in my decision to do this weird skipping to the last chapter thing, because I did kind of already know the story a bit. That being said, the last chapter actually did surprise me, and it did not end the way that I thought it would. I don't know if it was different from the movie or if I just really didn't remember the movie, because I had only seen it once and I didn't super remember it, but I knew I had seen it. But then that last chapter was really surprising, and it did make me interested enough that what I ended up doing was I kind of went back and skimmed those 100 pages just to see kind of a bare outline of how it got to that final chapter. It was a really weird reading experience for me. And I do think that those last 100 pages seemed like they were probably more interesting and exciting than the whole rest of the book. Kind of unfortunate that I decided to do the whole skip ahead thing, although I don't completely regret it, because overall I really did not like this book. It takes a lot for me to DNF a book. So kind of going back to the beginning now that I've explained the whole DNF situation. First of all, there were just so many characters that it was really hard to keep track of them all, and I really just didn't care about any of them. None of them felt really super developed to me, and it was so back and forth so quick between characters that I just didn't connect with any of them. And then also with each character, I felt like we got a really big info dump of kind of the highlights of their life rather than actually like getting to know the characters. And yeah, I just found basically all the characters really unlikable, which obviously this is a book where the characters are kind of supposed to be a little bit unlikable. Not all of them, but like certainly the very gossipy family members are kind of meant to be a little bit unlikable. But I found that even the characters that were supposed to be likable were either entirely bland or still I really did not like them. One big example for me would be Astrid. I think she was supposed to be a likable character, and I really did not like her at all. I feel like the book was trying to convince us that she was this cool, rebellious girl who like wasn't as all caught up in the stuff as everyone else and like didn't care if she broke the rules. And she had this whole big info dump chapter where it was talking about these rebellious relationships she had had. But then like the whole present day storyline of the book for her is that her husband is cheating on her, and she's like groveling at his feet begging him to stay through the whole book, and is like really concerned with what her family and everyone else is going to think of this if they find out. And it just kind of negated all of this like backstory that she had been given. Which, like, I get in real life that, like, people can be that way, where they, like, try to put out this cool vibe in public, but then they really do care what people think and all that, but I don't know, it just did not sit well with me. And it actually made me care less about, like, the bad things her husband had done. It was like, you know, he sucks, but shrug, I don't really like her either. And then there are some characters where the purposeful making them unlikable is like over the top. They are just over the top unlikable, and it's just really not pleasant to read. I think there were definitely parts of the book where you could tell that it had a male author. There were just some parts that, I don't know, me reading it as a girl, I think I was uncomfortable with it. There's a scene where one of the rich girls brags about the fact that she's been having sex since she was 13, which is just problematic. Again, I'm under no delusion that this type of a person doesn't exist in the real world. I'm sure that it does. But I don't know, just when you hear someone bragging about that, doing that since the age of 13, it makes you worry about their mental health and wonder who hurt them, not think, oh, how edgy. And it's just not something I personally would put in a book to be like something that's like an okay thing to normalize. And there were, yeah, just a lot of stuff like that that kind of bothered me. And then there are other characters that just, their characterization was so unsteady to me. Like, the book is kind of focused around this big wedding that is going to be happening, and when we first meet the bride, she seems really nice, and she's a character that I actually kind of liked, and when she first came on the scene, I was like, oh, this is a character that I like. I'm interested to see where her story goes. And then she turned into a total bridezilla and was just as bad as all the other unlikable, purposefully unlikable characters in there, with the gossip and the being mean and everything. And then the other thing was the likable characters who were technically likable. They were likable in the sense that they were so bland that there was just nothing to dislike about them. And this is most especially applicable to our main character, Rachel. She just is, I don't know, feels like a non-character even though she's the main character. And her relationship is supposed to be the main relationship of the book, her and Nick, and we barely get to see them together because Nick is off doing wedding things with the other groomsmen, and Rachel gets stuck with the other bridesmaids / other friends and her friend who lives in this country. And so I just really got nothing out of what is the main romance and the main characters. And then there's also just the fact that Nick kind of isn't that great. Like, there's nothing really objectionable about him like some of the other characters, but like, he doesn't tell Rachel about his family, and he's just, I don't think they're super believable in their relationship, in that they just don't seem to communicate very much or very well. And then yeah, wrapping back around to the end, again, that seems like it was much more interesting than the whole rest of the book, and it definitely had some big twists and turns, but it does seem like it was kind of an abrupt ending. I'm not a super good judge on the ending since I sort of skimmed through it other than the last chapter. But yeah, all the twists just seemed very fast and very abrupt and kind of out of nowhere, and they certainly made the book more interesting, but I don't know if they made the book better quality. So yeah, overall this one was just a big miss for me. I'm not planning to keep this one. I'm not planning to continue the series. And considering the books that I read later in the month that I was excited to get to, I sort of wish that I could have just skipped this one and gone straight to them. So let's do that now. After Crazy Rich Asians, I read Brazinger by Christopher Paolini. This is the third book in the Inheritance cycle, which I have been rereading in order to prep for some short stories that he published last year that take place in the same world as this series, but I had not read The Inheritance Cycle in many years, so I wanted to refresh my memory. It is one of my favorite childhood series, and I've been really enjoying my reread. And I'm very excited to get to those short stories after the final book. And I am going to have spoilers for this book and the first two books, but none for the final book. So I remember back when Eragon was first coming out, and all the internet speculation on how it would end and, you know, various fan theories were coming out. I remember distinctly the fan theory about the title of this book. Originally, The Inheritance Cycle was meant to be a trilogy, but it got expanded to 4 books. But back when it was still going to be a trilogy, we had Eragon and Eldest, both titles that start with an E, and both titles that are 6 letters long. And so everyone thought for sure that the final book would be called Empire, which would have been so cool. I was so down for that theory, but then it ended up being Brazinger. So I kind of still mourn that really cool title that we could have had. But I do love the title Brazinger too, and of course it actually applies more to the books since he wrote it, he knew what he was doing. I like this one a lot. I think I probably like it the second most out of the whole series. Eldest for me was, I don't know, as a kid I always felt like Eldest was a little bit slower than the other books, which I still really love it. I love pretty much all the books pretty close to equally. But yeah, this one just had a lot going on in it, which was super exciting and entertaining. I will say the timelines are a little bit questionable kind of throughout the whole series, but they especially start to become questionable in this book. And mostly I just don't know if the small time frame that the series takes place in is really super believable. And then there are other little timeline things that just seem a little bit questionable, but certainly not enough to take you out of the story and not enough to like super notice unless you've read it a bunch of times. And like it certainly doesn't put me off the books at all. And this book, probably more than any of the other books, likes to go off on tangents. Like there's this whole chapter in this book with this character Tenga, who we never see again and never becomes important in the series, and his whole chapter, I kind of wonder how an editor didn't insist on cutting it because it doesn't seem super related to the rest of the series at all. There's some very light clues about Tenga is searching for the answer to a question, and it is very lightly implied that maybe Galbatorix, the king, is doing the same. And later in the book, one of our big characters, Angela, turns out stayed with Tenga for some time and that he was her mentor. But really, it doesn't ever play much of a big role in the story. And then there are some other tangents, like when Arya and Eragon are traveling together and he makes her this flower and she makes this little boat that then she sends off to float through the air for the rest of eternity, and they're visited by some spirits, and the spirits come into play a little bit later in the book in the sense that it gives us a little bit more information about how shades are made and things like that, but it's not information that like we really need to understand the story. And so yeah, there's kind of a lot of that stuff in this book, which some people might not like because, again, it doesn't really affect the story. It isn't necessary, but I personally really enjoy it. I think these are some of the more beautifully written scenes, and they're just fun things that are adding detail to the world and building the world up. And I like world building a whole lot, so anything that's learning more about the world that the book takes place in, I'm down for, even if it doesn't really affect the plot very much. And then one of the most exciting things in this book is that this is our first book where we get chapters from Saphira's perspective, from the dragon's perspective, which is so interesting. The author really worked to have her think differently than the human characters. This is the only non-human character perspective that we get. We don't get any dwarf perspectives or elf perspectives or Urgle perspectives, just humans and Saphira the dragon. So it's really fun to see what he came up with for making her perspective very unique from every other character's perspective. And it's just kind of funny to get to see her personality and how full of herself she is. Rightfully so, she is a dragon. But it's just funny to hear her thoughts about how she's the most beautiful creature in the land and everything, and she really just is strutting it. And yeah, her interesting way of sort of naming things in her head, like when she's flying, how she thinks about the different types of ground and wind, because obviously that's important for her to think about when she's flying, so that's all interesting too. And then getting into the end of the book, I really like how in the second and the third book, the reason behind the title is revealed at the very end of the book. Eldest, of course, is called Eldest because at the end, Eragon finds out that Murtaugh is his brother, and Murtaugh is the elder brother, and therefore has the right to their father's inheritance. And then at the end of Brazinger, we find out that Brazinger is called Brazinger because Eragon names his sword Brazinger. And so I like books that kind of leave the meaning behind the title until the end to be revealed. It makes for kind of an exciting, like, that's why. But then the very end of the book on this one kind of is a bit of a miss for me. At the end of the book, these magicians are attempting to make a shade and they succeed, and shades are apparently so hard to kill that only, I think, 3 people have done it and survived in the history of the land. One of them being Eragon in the first book, and the other 2 being far before the stories started. And these magicians managed to make this shade, and within 5 minutes, Arya has killed the shade and survived the experience. And so it just comes off a little bit ridiculous. And it's kind of like this false, like, trying to make the audience scared, but then being like, oh no, don't worry, we're done with this already. And then also, I feel like the death of Ormus and Gladir was very rushed. I do think them dying was something that needed to happen in the story, but they die in their very first battle after leaving Elismira. They've been hiding in the elves' forest for hundreds of years in order to train a new rider and protect the knowledge set that they have, and because Ormus is injured, as is Gladir, and so they know that they can't defeat Galbatorix, and it is more important to train a new rider. But they decide that they're going to leave the safety of Elismira because they have accomplished their task. They have trained Eragon to be the new rider, and now they want to help in the war effort. And then they die in their very first battle that they enter, and so it just feels pointless that they left the forest at all. It feels like they didn't do anything to benefit the war effort. I think it would have been better if they had had a battle with Murtaugh and Thorn in which they somehow permanently injured one or both of them, much like they themselves are permanently injured. I feel like it would have helped the story to make future battles between Eragon and Murtaugh more believable and more high stakes, because up till this point, Murtaugh and Thorn have pretty much been superior because they have Galbatorix on their side. And so this would have been something that could have like evened the battle a little bit. And yeah, it just would have made Gladir and Ormus's death feel like it had a reason, like they didn't just go out and not accomplish anything. So I feel like they should have been able to injure those 2 in some way, and then perhaps Galbatorix intercedes in their next battle, and that would be when they die. So yeah, overall, the end of the book definitely had some problems, but I love the book and I love the series as a whole, and I'm really excited to get to the final book. The last book I read in July was An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green. I wanted to reread this book before reading the sequel, A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor. So I read this book in 2018 when it came out, and I really enjoyed it, but it definitely hits a little different in 2020 than it did in 2018. First of all, I found myself enjoying the character Maya a little more. She kind of takes a little bit of a backseat later in the book, which is maybe why I didn't notice her so much on the first read. But when I was first getting back into the book at the beginning, it just occurred to me how much I liked Maya, and I didn't really remember her super well. She just is a very put together character, and I feel like I connected with her more than some of the other characters. Definitely in how like organized she is and how she tries to talk to April. Just, I connected with all of that. But definitely all of the characters are pretty relatable and just come off very realistic and natural. But yeah, definitely, like I said, it was an interesting read in 2020. There was one quote in particular that kind of stood out. So the quote that kind of stood out was, "There was so much frustration and fear already that people were forcing themselves to stay awake so they could avoid the dream. Some taking amphetamines. But you can't not sleep. A couple of people had died. They had died of the fear that Peter Petrowicki was peddling." Which I will say, Peter Petrowicki kind of reminded me of a certain real-life pundit who I won't name because I read this book and so I learned the lessons. But yeah, that quote in particular made me think of a certain someone saying that hydrochloroquine was like a good thing to be taking right now during COVID. And yeah, definitely, no matter when you're reading this book, it just gives you a lot to think about and definitely has some really interesting points to make, but also just has like really fun, strange things that you wouldn't find in any other book, like the dream that everyone gets infected with and everyone is just dreaming the same dream is, for me, the most kind of fun, interesting part of the book, and you know, isn't quite as heavy as some of the other things that are in the book. And definitely an absolutely remarkable thing, just feels like now. So I'm really excited to read the sequel. I'm excited to see where this is going. It had such a drop-off ending, and the like very ending, like after the whole warehouse ending, the text message ending and all of that definitely gave it an even bigger drop off. And yeah, definitely just really excited to get into the next book and see how this one ends, which I will be starting to read tomorrow, so happening soon. So yeah, these are the 3 books that I read in July. 2 rereads this month, and 1 pretty big disappointment. Let me know what you've been reading this month and whether or not you've been doing an absolutely remarkable thing reread, or if you've read A Beautifully Foolish Endeavor, although no spoilers please, because I have not read it yet. Thanks for watching. Remember, words matter.